sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for. When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth. In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Hello, one and all. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. I'm Ethan Nash, one of your co-hosts, and I have with me today, as per usual, Mr. Michael Nash.
Hey.
Mike, Dad, how are you doing today? How's it going?
I'm good, man. I'm good, Ethan. I'm good, son. It's great to be with you here again.
We're excited for what we have to talk about today, and I hope you are too. Let me start out by asking you this question. Can you think of a time when you were maybe in a group setting and you felt like you had something important to say in that conversation or something relevant to say in that conversation, and you ended up holding back? Is that a situation you've personally been in before?
Actually, yes. That brings up a couple of things for me. On one hand, I will say absolutely. I would guess probably everyone has. I can think of a spiritual community I was a part of for many years, in which quite often felt like it wasn't really okay for me to say what I was thinking or ask a specific kind of a question. So yeah, I would hide. I would hold back. And then on the other hand, I think I also have this tendency to maybe go the other way in other settings. I'm kind of a open mouth, insert foot kind of guy, and just kind of speak out and say what I think. But I've gotten punished for that a few times.
So it sounds like you both had the experience in your spiritual community that you used to be a part of, in which you didn't feel totally safe coming forward with saying what you thought needed to be said. And it sounds like you've also experienced saying something and then realizing that wasn't necessarily safe in this group to say that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. Have you had situations like that where you felt like you had to hold back?
Yeah. I've been in that situation before. I remember actually going all the way back to my undergraduate years. I was working and doing some journalism for one of the departments there. And I remember just in the group of people there, mostly I held back asking questions because I thought they were dumb questions, or I thought people would kind of look at me and think like, how could he be so dumb not to understand this? Like, that was my mindset going into that. It turned out in that situation, I found out later, other people had the same question and they were also holding back from asking it. It's interesting. Actually, just the other day, I was working with a group and I asked this question, have you ever experienced that before in a group? And basically everybody in that room kind of nodded and smiled and understood that is something that they've experienced before. And I think most people have. Can you think of a group or a team you were on, even a person that you were around, in which you generally felt safe to show up as you? You felt safe to, quote unquote, ask dumb questions. You felt safe to maybe state an opinion or a thought that others might not agree with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I have had lots of experiences like that with small groups, every so often with a large group, possibly, but absolutely one-on-one. Yeah, I've got some great relationships in which I feel super safe and I feel like I can be just who I am and I'm not going to receive any consequences for that. And it feels beautiful. It feels wonderful.
And that's the topic of today, is safety in the context of psychological safety. Now, last episode, we talked about kind of the manager's radar and these 6 things that we encourage every leader, every manager to get on their radar. And one of them, of course, was having to do with the fact that psychological safety is the key to a healthy and high-performing team. And so we're going to dive into that piece right there a bit today, talk about psychological safety. We're going to talk about, what it is, what it isn't. We're going to talk about how you may go about how a leader can go about creating that within their teams and their culture, and then leave you with some, hopefully some practical tips and hints of things you can do with your team to go about building psychological safety. Before we get there, let's just quickly review the 6 things to put on your radar as a manager that we discussed last week. I would encourage you to go back to listen to that episode because it's going to provide more context for this one, of course. But let's just go through those quickly. The first one being, so to be an effective leader, you need to be growing and developing yourself as a human being.
Yep. Number 2, morale really matters. And it's mostly your job if you're a manager.
And number 3 is to be effective as a leader, as a manager, you really need to demonstrate that you have your employees' best interests at heart.
Yeah. Number 4, management involves an actual specific set of skills.
And number 5 is, of course, adaptive skills are the most important kind of skills.
Yeah. And that leads us to today, the 6th thing that we hope to get on managers' radar as we're doing workshops and training and coaching is that psychological safety is absolutely the key to building healthy relationships with employees.
Absolutely. So let's zoom in. Let's double click on that number 6. Psychological safety is the key to healthy teams. Let's talk for a moment about what a healthy team is. What exactly does a healthy team look like? What are some of the behaviors that you would see in this super, hypothetical, really healthy team? From your experience, Dad, from working with, many different teams, some healthy, some not as healthy. What have you seen with the teams that are the most healthy?
Wow, so many things. It's a great question. We ask this question quite often in our workshops, and we just get, double whiteboards filled with answers and responses and phrases and words on this. I would start, I think, with the general category of kind of how humans treat other humans. On the healthiest teams, you're going to see high levels of respectful behaviors. Everything from, the kind of listening where people really feel heard. So I think that's probably one of the most important behaviors. The way we respond when we disagree with somebody in a respectful way that, allows the person to disagree and doesn't shoot them down, that makes room for disagreement. Maybe the way we give feedback to one another, the way we receive feedback. A lot of the skills that we've talked about, I think, in this podcast. So yeah, I think the first category for me is sort of that, all the things we learned in kindergarten, right? The way we want to treat others the way you'd like to be treated yourself.
Right. So you're kind of talking about, a lot of what we would call the adaptive skills. Like, so a healthy team is a team that consistently practice adaptive skills, such as you referred to, listening in a way that demonstrates respect to each other, right? Giving feedback in a way that works on keeping you connected relationally, helping to lower that person's defenses, and, receiving feedback non-defensively to keep that channel of communication open. And there's obviously a general kind of underlying theme here of care and respect with each other in our interpersonal interactions, right? In our communications. Does that sound correct to you? Is that a fair paraphrase of that?
Yeah, that's really well done. That's exactly it. And it leads to this other thought, which is, I think the healthiest teams are what we call elastic as opposed to brittle, meaning the analogy being, you grab that old rubber band out of your drawer that's been there for 10 years and you stretch it out and it just breaks because it's so brittle, as opposed to a real elastic, rubber band. It's really cool to see teams where people can make mistakes, or the team themselves can maybe go down the wrong path and recover from that, where people can forgive each other, where people can repair relationships, when people can recover from a difficult conversation, willing to let go, that whole general category of elasticity in those relationships.
Kind of at a high level, when I think about a healthy team, I think about a team for one, there tends to be a general clarity around kind of purpose and mission in that group, and everybody's on the same page with that. Right. There is consistency as far as, where we're trying to head towards and what we're trying to do here. The other side of that, a team that's not as healthy, maybe that's not clear. Maybe not, people are not necessarily on the same page of what they're trying to accomplish on this team. So I think at a high level, there's that purpose there. I also think just on a healthy team, and information and knowledge is shared openly and as needed. And of course, that could be information such as, of course, data or reports. But also when I talk about information, it could be information like, I need help with this, right? That's a form of information. In a healthy team, that type of information is shared with each other. And so there's kind of an understanding of what people need and where people are at. So I think that's a piece right there. The information and knowledge is shared openly and as needed.
Yeah, that's good. And that gets to, yeah, like you said, things like the ability to ask for help and to say, I don't know, and all those great things. I also think of just the commitment to one another's success is high level teams are those teams in which, I know that if you're successful, that makes us successful. So I'm actually going to spend some of my resources, some of my time, some of my energy helping you be successful, as opposed to the every man for himself. As long as I win, then it's great. As long as I get what I need, or as long as I, get a good annual review, everything's fine. No, it's really about all of us being successful, which means that I'm going to at times not necessarily get an A+ or a home run in my area, maybe because I need to spend some time helping you be successful in your area.
Right. So in a healthy team, there is more or less the absence of kind of win-lose thinking, competition between the team members. An organization is a system, right? And so a team is also a system. And, the healthier that system is, the better it performs, because the health, I think, maximizes all the individual talent on that team. It maximizes the intelligence. It maximizes the skills and knowledge that's on that team. As the old cliche adage goes, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so when I think about healthy teams, it's less about who is on that team and more about how that team interacts with each other. Over and over again, when you look at the research of the most successful teams, it's about how that team interacts that makes them successful, which I think is an important piece to really hold on to here as we talk more about healthy teams. The healthiest teams that I've seen, they make actual commitments with each other around the behavioral norms that would help to maximize everything in that system, right? Has that been your observation as well, as healthy teams are pretty intentional about those behaviors?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a, we do common commitments with groups all the time. And I think the idea is that, if you don't attend to the culture of the work group, it doesn't necessarily, it actually tends to degrade over time. And so that intentionality about deciding who we're going to be, how we're going to show up, how we're going to behave, being a very intentional decision that a group makes together, and that they explicitly commit to behaviors and commit to not engaging in other behaviors. For example, we're not going to triangulate about one another. We're not going to badmouth each other outside this room. We're committed to not behaving that way. What we are committed to, on the other hand, is supporting and promoting each other outside of this room, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be an example of kind of one on each side of that scale.
Right. Agreed. And I would also say, and I would imagine you would agree with me, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the foundation to a healthy team is this idea of trust, right? There's generally a high level of trust on that team. And of course, building trust, there's behaviors to practice that would help that team kind of earn trust with each other. But generally speaking, a team is only going to be as healthy as their level of trust, in my opinion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I way agree with that, Ethan. The most important ingredient is trust. And it's not good enough, right, just to say that. I've worked with a lot of people, a lot of teams who haven't figured out the contours of that word. They really haven't defined what we're talking about, because I know we've talked about this here in this podcast. Trust itself is really, really, really a big word. Like, it's being asked to carry so many things, right? Everything from, I trust your integrity, meaning I trust that you're going to be honest. I mean, that's huge, all the way to, I trust that you are going to deliver the report on time because you tend to deliver on time. So I trust you in that area. Those are two aspects of trust that don't even balance each other, right? I mean, one of them is integrity, all the way down to, well, I trust that you're going to, have something on time. The word trust is just being asked to carry too many things. And so when we talk about trust being the most important ingredient. I agree with that, with the caveat that we focus in on a very particular kind of trust.
Yeah, I agree. And trust does carry a lot. Like you were saying, there's all different types of trust, right? And so I think what we're getting at here is we're kind of focused on this big type of trust, right? The trust that on this team we have each other's backs. The trust that it's safe to show up as you, right? The trust that it's okay to make mistakes without punishment. The most important type of trust, in my opinion, for a healthy team is this idea of psychological safety. And so would you mind just defining a little bit of what psychological safety is?
Well, I think in general, we're talking about, I think the word safety is in there because it's a belief, right? I believe that when I'm with you, Ethan, when we're together, that I can show up authentically. I believe that I can give you feedback. I can even say something stupid and something I wished I hadn't said. And I'm not going to get punished for that. I think that's the bottom line, that if I show up as my true self, including my flaws, including my mistakes, including my wrong answers, including maybe the time I got a little upset and I said something I wished I wouldn't have said, I'm not going to have some kind of long-term punishment from you. You're not going to reject me. I think that's psychological safety in a relationship. And that same thing can apply to a group of people.
Let me just read you briefly the definition of psychological safety that was defined by Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson. Now, Amy Edmondson kind of brought the term psychological safety into the mainstream. The term psychological safety has actually been around for a long time, but she is the one that really started putting actual research and study to psychological safety. And so her definition is psychological safety is the belief that while in a particular group of people, you have the freedom to speak out, make mistakes, disagree, and be authentic without fear of being rejected, embarrassed, or punished, which basically is exactly what you just said, right? There's a key word there that I like to hone in on when I talk about psychological safety, which is the freedom to make mistakes. I want to talk for just a second about why it's so important that a team has some freedom to make mistakes. At the end of the day, the ability to not just make mistakes, but be transparent about those mistakes, right? Talk about those mistakes, because we're all making mistakes. That just happens. But can we talk about those mistakes without feeling like I got punished for showing that I made that mistake? And that's really important for teamwork. Getting some things wrong and figuring out how we need to change is how innovation happens, right? It's how advancement happens. So ultimately, we need to be okay with failing so we can learn how to change. Now, what, in your opinion there, Michael, I mean, what would happen if a team generally doesn't want to talk about their mistakes? Like what could be some of the outcomes of that?
Mistakes would be made and hidden, and then we're going to go down the wrong path and we're not going to self-correct and we're not going to pivot. I've seen groups do that, or individual members of groups who aren't willing to say that they don't know or that they've made a mistake. And so we get to decisions that aren't the right decision. I think another part of that definition that really pulls at me is the authenticity part of it. If you're in a group of people and you can't say, I'm not sure, or I don't know, or if you can't say, I disagree with that, or if you can't say, I'm uncomfortable with where we're heading, I think we should step back. I mean, if you can't say those things, I think you're in huge danger zone as a group, as an organization, as an executive team, whatever, because, it's people are just going to kind of nod and smile and go along, and the train goes right off the tracks. And you go back later and do debriefing, and people will say, well, I was, concerned, or I wasn't sure this was going to work, or I had a different idea. And well, why didn't you say that then? Well, when I dig into that situation, when I ask those questions, most of the time the answer comes back to some version of, I did not feel safe.
Yeah, it's interesting when Amy Edmondson, who I referred to earlier, when she first started studying psychological safety on teams, she was originally looking at psychological safety in teams in the hospital setting. And so she collected all this data. She was measuring psychological safety and the performance of that team. And then she went back and was kind of looking at the data, and she thought, oh, great. This is awesome. It looks like psychological safety is statistically significant correlation with the performance of the team. Great. Awesome. But then she looked at it closer and she's like, oh, wait, the line's going in the wrong direction. In her data, it looked like the more psychological safety a team had, the more mistakes they were making. And when I first heard that, I thought about that. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. But then when I thought about that further, I kind of figured out what was going on. Like, why would a team with more psychological safety have more mistakes? What do you think is going on there?
Well, yeah, what they found was there was not more mistakes. There was more reported mistakes.
Exactly. And what that led to was less catastrophic mistakes down the road, right? Because they were able to identify and talk about mistakes early on in the processes, they were able to avoid what they sometimes call bad patient outcomes, right? Which I think is an important concept for any leader to hold on to. So that's a little bit about what psychological safety is. And we're going to get into the behaviors that would help build that in just a bit. But I also want to ask you, this term psychological safety, there's the word safety in there. I feel like there's some misconceptions about the phrase psychological safety when they hear it. What isn't psychological safety?
It can be, and I've heard it be confused a little bit with sort of safe space and we got to make sure that nobody ever has uncomfortable feelings. And, I've heard it kind of ridiculed a little bit because the word safety is embedded right in there. And that's really not what this is. There is a misperception about, this is another way of answering your question. What is it not, right? It is not just a carte blanche freedom to just spew whatever you want to spew. And I've worked with organizations, specifically a couple different executive teams in my career, where the leader was promoting a kind of psychological safety, but it was more along that vein. These two leaders I'm thinking of kind of had the idea that, for this team to be healthy, we need to be able to call each other out on each other's crap at any time, in any way. And if you can't take it, then, you're not fit for this team kind of thing. And so this weird misperception they had about psychological safety was actually destroying the psychological safety within that group, because it was really more about sort of brutal honesty. And that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, there's kind of two ends of the spectrum that I think people can get caught up on. If people go in that direction that you're talking about, where we just got to be able to say anything and everything and have no social skills, right? That's going to harm the safety of that team. And then the other side, of course, is where everybody is so worried about what they can say and not say that people tend to really, hold back important things that may need to be said. There's kind of a middle point between these two where I think is a sweet spot for creating high levels of psychological safety. So with all that said, I want to talk a bit about what we've identified as the three kind of general roadblocks to psychological safety on a work team. All right. And the first one, and I would like to hear you speak more about this, Dad, but the first one is transference. That's the first roadblock to psychological safety. So what exactly is transference, and how might that create roadblocks to someone's individual sense of psychological safety on a team?
Yeah, the transference is happening. For example, when you're working with somebody and they say something like, this person, they said this thing that bothered me, and I am never, ever going to trust them again. And it's a hint that there might be something going on there that's beyond what's happening right there between those two people in that relationship. Transference is the idea that I'm taking my past experiences around trust in relationships, and I'm transferring those experiences right onto this present situation. So this person right now in my life that I'm deciding I'm never going to trust again, that's not just about what happened between me and this person. It's my own wounds, right? It's my own scars. It's my own history. I've been burned in the past by people, or I learned as a very young person that I couldn't really trust my parents to care about me, or I couldn't trust the last couple of bosses I had to actually have my best interests at heart. And I got burned and I got hurt. And so I take these situations, and it's unconscious, right? I put those situations onto the current relationship or the current group. And I think it's important that when we start talking about psychological safety, that we keep in mind that we ourselves have a part in our own psychological safety. It's not just if everyone else will treat me well, I can be psychologically safe, or if my boss has my best interest at heart, then I can finally be psychologically safe, right? It's not just that. I actually have the ability to give and gift trust to the people around me. And my past experiences with relationships are going to have a huge impact on my ability today to trust people.
Yeah, we all bring different, past experiences around psychological safety into our current workplaces, right? An important practice here for every individual on a work team, which is, working to maybe gain some awareness around the transference that you might be bringing into that situation. And I think this brings us back to what you were talking about before about kind of the brittle relationships versus elastic relationships, right? In elastic relationships, we're willing to work through mistakes, or we're willing to maybe give some grace. We're willing to have the conversations to fix it, right? And I think that as we become aware of our transference, we can understand, okay, do I need to take some extra steps to make sure I'm forming elastic relationships and gifting trust towards people?
It's a really deep and personal and sometimes long journey. I don't want to underplay this. I think that for human beings to discover their roadblocks, their internal roadblocks to trusting other people, that is deep, deep work. And it's one of the reasons we say over and over again, we reiterated this today, right, in this podcast, that one of the things we want to have on our radar as managers is our own personal growth. And I would apply this now to anyone that's part of a team, anyone in relationship, right? When we talk about psychological safety, we're not just talking about teams, we're talking about relationships, including work relationships, personal relationships, right? So finding our own issues of transference, finding out where we have wounds that keep us from gifting trust to people. I think that's really, really important work. We could spend a season of podcasts talking about that work right there.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Again, people need to work on gifting trust in others, right? But also people in a work group need to work at earning trust in others, right? If everybody in the work group is just focused on gifting trust, but nobody has any focus of earning that trust, well, that's not going to work, right? You're not going to build psychological safety on that team. And so another roadblock to psychological safety, or potential roadblock, would be the dynamics of that team, right? How people behave with each other on that team. So that being said, let me ask you, what are some of the behaviors that a team could engage in that would build psychological safety, or rather that would help earn psychological safety and trust with others on that team?
Yeah, I think that as far as team members, there's all sorts of things that we can do and avoid doing, right? That will create or potentially build psychological safety, right? And we've mentioned a few of them already today, and even in the past, we've talked a lot about listening. I think that's a real big bang for the buck. When I feel that you're curious about what I think and you're listening in a way that makes me feel respected and heard, at that point, I feel seen. I don't feel judgment, because the way you're listening to me is, I'm assuming, would be, again, curious and open. You're probably listening in a way that's affirming what I'm saying and at least paraphrasing, right? So when I experience that kind of behavior from somebody, I almost even physically feel my body start to relax, right? Because I'm starting to feel more and more safe in this situation or in this relationship. So one of the most important behaviors, I would say, is really deep listening. I'll just kind of do an opposite here, meaning something that I would want to not have happening, if I want to have psychological safety in this group, I want to know that what I'm saying to you is not going to be advertised someplace else. I want to know that I can state an opinion in this team and not have that come back and bite me later because you've told someone outside of the room. It's that whole idea of safety and confidentiality, that you're protecting this space that we have here to talk and share. So, I mean, those are just two examples, one a do and one a don't. So I'll toss the ball back to you, Ethan. What's one thing on either side of that coin that you would identify as important here?
Another key behavior that a team could engage in to build the psychological safety on that team would be just generally practicing humility, right? Individual team members that are willing to say, hey, I made a mistake here, or you're better at this than me. It's just a general sense of we're all willing to show that we're human beings. And I think when a team member sees somebody else showing humility, whether that's through admitting a mistake or otherwise, that gives other people the freedom to also show their humility as well. And then, of course, on the opposite side of that coin is a team that nobody owns up to a mistake, right? Nobody's willing to say somebody does something better than they do, or even not willing to say, hey, I need help with something. And so humility is a key piece there.
That's great. I think of, on the positive side, this is really closely related to what I said earlier about listening, but it's not quite the same. It's about asking questions and it's about being curious. And I'm going to feel more psychologically safe when I know that the people around me are actually curious about what I think, curious about who I am, and actually want to know who I am. I feel more safe in a situation, in a relationship, when I know the other person wants to know me. And that's actually key in terms of even the idea of feeling liked, right? When I know that somebody actually appreciates and likes me, so much easier for me to let down my guard, right? So I think that whole general category there is why we like to see groups of people, executive teams, departments, spend some time together, spend some time socially, spend some time with icebreakers, spend some time asking questions, getting to know each other. That whole area of trust being built through vulnerability is really an important aspect of building psychological safety.
Yeah, absolutely. You alluded to this, but just being appreciative of each other on the team, right? And to build a psychologically safe team, people need to be able to point out when somebody else has done something well, or to say thank you, or to call out good work. And I think sometimes we get so focused on how we give constructive feedback that we forget that the positive feedback is really important. And we have an emotional bank account with people, right? And when you're giving feedback, you may not do it perfectly every time, and so you're going to take withdrawals maybe from that emotional bank account. But we got to keep making deposits by giving affirmations, saying thank you, acknowledging the good stuff. In my opinion, one of the most important things for a healthy team.
Yeah. I call that the relational bank account. And I mean, I'm going to be grumpy, which will be a withdrawal, or I'm going to not agree with your idea, which will be a withdrawal, or I'm going to overreact, or, et cetera. Right. So just keep depositing. Another thing I'm throwing there is the hugely important area of not penalizing me when I decide to take the huge risk of giving you feedback. Right. And I'm talking now about corrective feedback, right? So I want to share something that happened in the meeting last week, something you said that, I felt kind of shut down. I want to be able to do that. And keep in mind that for me to approach you, anyone with something like that, it takes courage. So it's a tender moment. I think when we put ourselves out there and we are vulnerable enough to give feedback, and make no mistake, that's vulnerability in action right there, right? When you get up the guts to give someone feedback. And if that person just starts punishing me by immediately going to denial or throwing feedback back at me or getting defensive or getting angry or whatever, I mean, it took a ton of guts to approach you with this. And now I'm getting punished. Okay, so what's going to happen now? Well, it's really unlikely that I'm going to do that again, right? I'm going to retreat into a place that does not feel psychologically safe. And you are not going to hear from me when you've stepped on my toes or when you've done something that I think has harmed the success of the group. You're just not going to hear from me.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And everything you said there, it comes back to this concept I've been thinking about kind of this idea of lowering the threshold for honesty. It's kind of lowering the threshold to be able to give feedback. And you can do that through all the ways that were mentioned, right? By practicing giving feedback in a way that works, right? And that keeps you connected relationally, and receiving feedback non-defensively from people. So you keep that channel of communication open so they can continue to, give honest feedback to you. So working, and listening just really well, right, tends to make people want to be more honest, right, with what they're thinking, what they're feeling, that's relevant to kind of the task at hand in this work group. Yeah, I'm curious what you think about that one of, even creating specific processes where people kind of know that this is what we're doing here. We're giving feedback.
Yeah, I think doing it safely, doing it thoughtfully, I think those can backfire, but I'm a big believer in groups basically going to the gym and exercising their muscles in this area, right? And so setting up intentional situations where people are going to be encouraged to maybe push a little bit past their comfort zones in this area. For a group to actually even think about their psychological safety or the level of psychological safety in that group, it's really important to intentionally focus on this area.
Another one I thought of here, and this would be something that you'd probably see more in kind of a meeting setting, but meetings in which people let other people in the room have a voice, where we understand in this room that everybody has, some different processing styles. And so for those that may, take longer to process, we're being intentional about saying, hey, what do you think about this? Right? I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on this. And so I think that's a key thing right there. People that seek feedback from others, right? People that seek opinions from others, a group that generally wants to hear from everybody, and everybody has a voice in that room.
Yeah, that's that curiosity I was talking about, that we turn to our colleagues and say, I'm really curious. I'm interested. What do you think? Right. And what does everyone think about this? And that we leave space, we leave airtime. We really create the atmosphere where that can all happen, which does, by the way, require enough time as well. This is not the kind of thing that's going to happen when you go to the, let's only have 12-minute meetings from now on kind of stuff.
And by the way, at the start of this conversation, I mentioned that the healthiest teams out there that I've seen, create commitments around the behaviors that they're going to practice. And that's kind of what we're talking about right here. Like, these are the behaviors that we encourage teams to make some commitments around. Of course, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to do this perfectly all the time, right? Because part of the commitment is a commitment to forming elastic relationships, right? Knowing that we're going to mess up on some of these commitments. But these are what I would encourage organizations and teams to institutionalize into their work groups, right? Hey, we are committed to giving feedback in this way. We are committed to listening with respect, right? We're committed to receiving feedback non-defensively. And that can go a long ways just in building a culture around psychological safety.
The thing about that, I 100% agree. It's those commitments. But just a warning there is that I've seen groups kind of approach that, but they kind of miss the mark. And so it's partly because, for one, they use very general terms. Like, they will quite often have a common commitment that says we will show each other respect, right? And I've seen tons of documents that say something like that, and it just doesn't mean anything, right? So one of the problems is very general terms, and the second problem is, taking a phrase like you said and said, okay, we're going to receive feedback non-defensively. People don't naturally know what that even looks like, right? People don't know what that means. And so even to narrow it down to something like that, or I'm going to listen so the other person feels heard, right? If there's no digging into what that actually looks like, what that feels like, how it shows up, it's not going to be sustainable. People are going to try and they're going to fail, and there'll probably be no correcting happening in the moment. And so we go back to where we were. And so the key really is to take each of these behaviors and work into it, lean into it, do some training on it, figure out what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And that takes time, and that takes work, and that takes energy.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? If you just keep it at high level, right? Receive feedback non-defensively. Well, everybody in that room may have a different idea of what that looks like, right? There's probably a lot of crossover, but unless you define it, it doesn't really mean anything. And so, yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And by the way, I'll link to these in the show notes, but we've done episodes on, how to give feedback in a way that keeps you connected relationally and actually work, right? And we've done an episode on how to receive feedback non-defensively and some mindsets and behaviors to practice there, right? How to listen respectfully. So I encourage you to go back and maybe listen to some of those episodes to get an idea of, in a little bit more detail, our thoughts on how that behavior would show up in a healthy way. Let me just throw one more thing out here. I think a team that wants to build some psychological safety also makes commitments around what to do when we have some angst with somebody else, right? What to do when we have a problem with somebody else, right? How to generally have healthier conversations or deal with that angst in a healthier way, as opposed to just kind of talking to them, talking about that person behind their back or something like that. And so, I think a lot of that, a lot of those skills comes back to being able to give and receive feedback as well. But also, it's just like, what are we going to do when we have angst with somebody else? So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, because it's a whole big piece that we've also done an episode on. But I find that to be a pretty key ingredient in healthy teams.
That's really important. I think that's an underappreciated team skill, I think, is, when things go sideways, or when we face a problem, or I'm facing a problem with you, or there's something in the way, how do we work through that, right? How do we recover from that? And I think that's a really important, like I was saying earlier, it's a skill to kind of dig into and figure out what that specifically looks like. One of the things that we often do with our groups, especially our higher level, meaning, sort of like an executive team group, we spend a lot of time talking about how important it is to keep those channels clean and open, and repairing those things. And so we'll often have all the members of that team draw a circle on a piece of paper and write all the names of the people on that team around the circle, like kind of like a clock face, right? And then I ask them to identify where they are on the circle, they themselves, and draw arrows from them to anyone else on that team where they feel it could be really helpful for us to have a private conversation. And I give them a lot of different categories. It could be, there's some feedback I need to give you, right? There's something that's been a problem for me that I need to talk to you about, right? Or it could be, there's problems between your team, your department, and my department, and I think we could fix those problems if we were to get together and work this out. Or, it could even be, I'm wondering if maybe there's something going on between us. I'm good, but I'm sensing that maybe you're not good with me. I want to check that out. It could be even that. And so we encourage people to identify where those helpful conversations could be, and then commit to having those conversations over the next 30 days or so. But before we launch them into that, we say, look, let's talk about how to do that, right? How do you approach the person? How do you bring this up? How do you give the feedback? You mentioned earlier, Ethan, not talking about the person's character, but instead talking about the behavior. We talk about owning the part that might be ours. I mean, there's lots of different skills attached to that ability to approach somebody else and clean something up, or repair something, or work through an issue. So again, it's a matter of committing to doing that, which is not easy for a lot of groups. And it's about knowing how to do that, so that when you go to give that feedback or go to have that conversation, that you're not creating more problems or, degrading psychological safety by the way you approach the person.
Yeah. So as you can see, I mean, again, psychological safety and the behaviors that were created is around how people interact with each other. I mean, that's obvious at this point. And so, we've given you some ideas as far as behaviors that team could engage in to build psychological safety. Anything else you want to say here in terms of kind of the behaviors that we're talking about, the team dynamics? Yeah. Anything else that you want to add?
The only thing I would add is really not an addition. It's kind of a repeat that, this area, what do we need to do as a group to enhance and build our psychological safety? And what do we want to avoid doing so that we don't hurt the psychological safety? I just want to say again that it's really valuable time, and it's hard for groups to do this because it takes time away, right, from the quote real work. And so it's challenging for groups to stop and spend time on this. but the benefits and the reward and the payoff is just, it's hard to predict, and it's hard to calculate ahead of time. Because again, when you don't have the psychological safety that we're talking about, you just spend a lot of time going down paths you shouldn't have gone down, or avoiding issues that really should be faced into, or making decisions that you shouldn't have made, or whatever. So you end up spending way more time in the long run and not being as effective, right? In whatever your mission is. So I just really encourage groups to spend time digging into this area intentionally with a focus and with some energy and intent.
I love that. The old adage, right? You got to slow down to speed up, right? And yes, this takes time to talk about the behaviors on the team that you all want to engage in. It takes time to build commitments, but ultimately that leads to way better outcomes that I think we all want to get to. I know that when Google, of course, did this kind of famous study where they investigated the ingredients of their most successful teams, and they looked at, I think, over 200 different teams within their organization. And above all, it was psychological safety was the key ingredients of the most successful teams. And those teams tended to produce more revenue for the company, tended to have longer tenure on the team, right? People just stayed there longer because it's a positive environment to work in. They were more likely to kind of harness diverse ideas. And so it's a thing. Psychological safety is a real key factor for performance. And so with that said, we still have more to talk about with psychological safety. We were talking about the roadblocks to psychological safety here, with that being, of course, your transference that you're bringing into the situation, and then the dynamics of that team. We have one more roadblock to talk about, as well as get into some other, maybe practical steps for building psychological safety that you and your team can practice right now. So we'll pick that up in the next episode. Stay tuned. We will see you soon.